In the previous segment, we saw that until a very short time ago, people did not think about science as something that gives humans new powers. Also, people thought that in any case, all the major discoveries that can be made have already been made, and that we now know everything that is important to know. Consequently, people did not believe in the possibility of progress. People thought that the golden age, the best of times, was in the past, and that the world is stagnant, if not deteriorating. If we follow the advice of the wise people of the past, such as Jesus and Muhammad and Buddha, we might save the world from deterioration. But we cannot possibly overcome by ourselves the fundamental problems of the world, such as war or disease or poverty. If even Muhammad and Jesus and Confucius, who knew everything there is to know, were unable to abolish famine completely, to solve all the diseases and poverty and war, how can we expect to do it by ourselves? Many faiths, many religions believed that someday a Messiah would come and the end of the world would come, and then all the wars and famines and even death itself will be abolished. But the notion that humankind, ordinary people, could overcome all these difficulties simply by discovering by themselves new knowledge and inventing new tools, this was worse than ludicrous. This was hubris. However, when people in the last few centuries, in the modern age, began to admit that there are many important things that we still don't know, progress suddenly seemed much more likely, or at least possible. If we can discover new important knowledge, and if new knowledge can be translated into new powers, then maybe we can solve problems that have previously been thought about as impossible, as things that we cannot overcome. As science, over the centuries, really began to solve one unsolvable problem after another, many people became convinced that humankind can overcome every and any problem simply by acquiring and applying new knowledge. Poverty, sickness, famine, wars, old age, even death are not the inevitable fate of humans. They are simply the result of our ignorance. A famous example for the new belief in progress is the case of lightning. Many cultures in history believed that lightning was the hammer of an angry god, and that gods used lightning in order to punish us sinners for bad things we do. In the middle of the 18th century, however, lightning drew the attention of Benjamin Franklin, one of the leading, not only political, but also scientific thinkers of America. In one of the most celebrated experiments in the history of science, Franklin flew a kite during a lightning storm in order to test the theory that lightning is simply electric current. And the empirical observations that Franklin made, coupled with the knowledge about electrical energy, how it functions, enabled Franklin to invent a new technology, the lightning rod, and basically to disarm the gods. Ever since we have the lightning rods, no matter how sinful we are, and no matter how angry the gods become, they have a lot of difficulty punishing us with lightning, because we know how to solve the problem of lightning. Another case in point, much bigger, more important than lightning, is the problem of poverty. Many cultures in history viewed poverty as an inescapable part of this world. The world is imperfect, and one of the imperfections of the world is that there is poverty. But today, it is more and more common to see poverty simply as a technical problem that can be solved. If we have enough knowledge, we can solve poverty. We assume, most of us assume, that if we enact policies which are based on the latest findings in agronomy, economics, medicine, sociology, and so forth, we can eliminate poverty from our country and from the world in general. And indeed, in many parts of the world today, the worst problems of poverty have been solved. Now, this sounds to many people, this may sound outrageous to say that the problem of poverty, at least in many parts of the world, have been solved, but what you need to realize is that throughout history, societies have suffered from two distinct kinds of poverty. There is social poverty. Social poverty means simply a gap in possibilities between the poor and the rich. In the case of social poverty, some people, the poor, are not given opportunities which are available to others, the rich. This is social poverty, it's relative. And the other kind of poverty is biological poverty. And this is not relative, this is absolute. Biological poverty means a situation in which the lives of individuals are at immediate risk of death due to lack of food and shelter. This is biological poverty and it's absolute. Now, social poverty, because it's relative, maybe it's impossible to solve it. Even if we have more and more wealth and power, there will always be gaps between poor and rich. But biological poverty in many countries around the world is no longer in existence. It's a thing of the past. People in many parts of the world no longer die because they are poor. Until very recent time, most people in most countries in the world lived very, very close to the biological poverty line. The biological poverty line is just measured by number of calories, the number of calories that a person needs in order to sustain life for a few more days. Most people lived very near this biological poverty line. And even very small miscalculations or misfortunes could easily push people below this line and cause them to die of hunger. For instance, if you sowed your field in the wrong season, or a flood came and washed away your field, you and your family died from hunger. On a collective level, natural disasters and man-made calamities often could cause entire populations to die from hunger, millions of people. In contrast, today, most of the people in the world have a kind of safety net stretched below them to protect them from death, from hunger and poverty. Individuals are protected from personal misfortune by insurance, by state-sponsored social security, and by all kinds of local and international organizations. When some disaster strikes an entire country or entire region, then worldwide relief efforts are usually, not always, but usually they are successful in preventing the worst from happening, in preventing the death of millions. People, of course, still suffer from numerous degradations and humiliations and all kinds of poverty-related illnesses. But in most countries in the world, nobody is actually starving to death, dying because they don't have bread to eat or rice to eat. Actually, today around the world, many more people are in danger of dying from eating too much than from starvation. But there is an even bigger problem than poverty that science seeks to solve. And this bigger problem, the most important problem of all, people would say, is the problem of death. Before the modern era, most religions and ideologies and philosophies, they took it for granted that death is the inevitable fate of humans. Moreover, most philosophies and religions and ideologies, they turned death into the main source of the meaning of life. Just try to imagine Islam or Christianity or the religion of ancient Egypt with all their pyramids and mummies in a world without death. They make no sense. These traditional religions, they taught people that people must come to terms with death and not seek to overcome death and live forever. The best minds in most traditional societies were busy giving meaning to death, not trying to overcome death. And this is the theme of, for example, the most ancient mythology that came down to us, the most ancient epic that came down to us from Sumer 5,000 years ago. This is its main thing. I'm talking about the famous story of King Gilgamesh of Uruk. According to Sumerian mythology, there was a big king called Gilgamesh who was king of the city of Uruk. And Gilgamesh was the most powerful, the wisest, the most beautiful man in the world. And he could do anything. He fought against giants and monsters and all that. Everywhere he went, he gained victories and managed to do everything he wanted. Until one day, the best friend of King Gilgamesh, a man called Enkidu, died in some disease that the gods sent to punish him. Enkidu died. And Gilgamesh refused to believe that this was happening. And he refused to allow the people to take the body of Enkidu and to bury it. And he just sat near the body of his best friend for 7 days and just kept guard, thinking that Enkidu is just sleeping and he will wake up. Until after 7 days, Gilgamesh saw worms starting to fall from the nostril of his friends because his body, his corpse, was eaten by worms, and they started to go up on the surface. And when Gilgamesh saw the worms coming out of the nostrils of his friend, he was struck by a terrible feeling. He was horrified. Not for the fate of Enkidu, but for his own fate, because he realized at that moment that what happened to Enkidu is going to happen to himself too. And he decided then and there that he would not let it happen. He will find a way to defeat death. He defeated so many monsters and giants and so forth, he will defeat death. So he left Uruk and went around the world searching for a cure to death, trying to defeat death. And the epic tells how Gilgamesh crosses oceans and deserts and mountains and fights against all kinds of horrendous monsters and scorpion men and so forth. But his quest ended in failure. After searching all over the world, he could not find any cure to death. And he came home with just one thing. He came home with the realization that death is the inevitable fate of humankind. When the gods created man, they set death as the limit of man, and that's it. We simply, even if you're Gilgamesh, even if you're the most powerful, wisest person in the world, you have to accept it. You have to learn to live with it. So this was the only thing that Gilgamesh discovered in his quest. True believers in scientific progress do not share this defeatist attitude of the Gilgamesh epic and of the many other stories and mythologies that people invented along the centuries to explain death. For men of science, for people who really believe in scientific progress, death is not the inevitable destiny of humankind. Death is simply a technical problem, like any other technical problem. Maybe more difficult, but not different in essence. Why do people die, according to science? People die not because the gods decreed that people must die. People always die due to all kinds of technical failures. They die because of a heart attack. They die because of cancer, because of an infection. And according to scientific wisdom, every technical problem has a technical solution. If the heart stops functioning well, Then you can stimulate the heart by implanting a pacemaker, or you can replace the heart, the dysfunctioning heart, with a new heart. If somebody is suffering from cancer, you can kill the cancer cells with drugs or radiation. If bacteria, dangerous bacteria are proliferating in your body, then take antibiotics. The antibiotics will kill the bacteria. It is true that at present, in the year 2013, we don't know how to solve all the different technical problems that cause death. But don't worry, we are working on it. The best minds in the world are no longer wasting their lives trying to find meaning to death. The best minds in the world are today busy investigating how the body works and how the DNA works, and they are busy trying to find cures for all the diseases and even for old age itself. We are all the time developing new medicines, new treatments, all kinds of artificial organs and so forth that will lengthen our lives and may one day enable us to defeat death itself and live indefinitely. Now, until recently, you would not have heard scientists or anybody else speak so bluntly. Defeating death, people said, no, this is not what we're trying to do. If you asked most doctors, until a few years ago, they would never say that we try to defeat death. They would say, we are trying to defeat cancer. We are trying to defeat tuberculosis. We are trying to find a cure to Alzheimer's. But people avoided speaking about defeating death, probably because the goal seemed to be too far away, and why create unreasonable expectations that may not be fulfilled anytime soon. But now, in the second decade of the 21st century, we are at a point when scientists and doctors are starting to speak more frankly and openly, starting to say clearly that the leading project of the scientific revolution, the leading project of modern science, is to give humankind eternal life. And not just to live forever, but to live forever young. I mean, nobody wants to live forever ill in a wheelchair connected to all kinds of tubes and computers. No, to defeat death and old age simultaneously. This is the big project of modern science, which we can call the Gilgamesh project. It was a project that King Gilgamesh in ancient Sumer gave up. Modern scientists took it up, and they are going to make it true. How long will the Gilgamesh project take us? Nobody really knows. Some say 200 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, we don't know. But when we recall how little we knew about the human body just 100 years ago in the early 20th century, and how much knowledge we've gained in a single century, this gives many people a lot of optimism. There are serious, very serious scholars today in the world that suggest that by the year 2050, less than 40 years from now, some humans, especially the rich ones who can afford all the treatments, some humans will already become immortal in the year 2050. Now, what is immortal? Immortal is different from immortal. Immortal is like God in the stories. God is immortal no matter what, he cannot die. Immortal is something different. Immortal is when you can still die. If, say, a truck runs you over, you're dead and nobody can bring you back to life. But immortal means that if no big accident happens, your life can be extended without limit. Every 10-20 years, you go to the hospital, you receive the necessary treatments, and you get another 10-20 years, and when this passes, you go again, and by then, they'll have even better treatments. Now, nobody probably would like, if you ask people if they want to live for 1,000,000 years, forever, nobody would like probably to live forever. But everybody would want to live for just another 10, 20 years in good health. And this is what some scholars say, this is what will happen by 2050. At least rich people will have the money to pay every 10, 20 years for treatment, which will extend their lives for another 10, 20 years. Even if this sounds outrageous to you, to defeat death completely, already what we have achieved in the last century or two is inconceivable in terms of what people knew and expected just 200 years ago. Today, all kinds of pills and injections and sophisticated operations save us from illnesses and injuries that 200 years ago or 100 years ago would have dealt us an inescapable death sentence. There was no way to overcome these difficulties, and today we overcome them easily. They also protect us, all the new treatments that were discovered in the last century, not only against death, but also against countless daily aches and ailments and diseases which pre-modern people simply accepted as part of life. If your tooth hurts 300 years ago, you go to somebody, even if you're the most powerful king in the world, and your tooth hurts, there is nothing to do. Somebody comes with a plier and takes your tooth out without anesthetics because they don't have anesthetics. But today, even quite poor people can afford to go to a dentist who will give them an injection and take out the tooth without feeling anything because of all these new discoveries. Over the last century, just 100 years, the average life expectancy of humans in the world jumped from about 30 years to about 67 years in the whole world and 80 years in the developed world. A baby born in the year 1900 was likely to die on average by the age of 30. A baby born today in the world, in the whole world, have a very good chance on average of living to be about 67, and if this baby is born in Japan or Sweden or Australia, he or she is likely to live to be at least 80. And babies born today in 2013, it's estimated that by the time they'll be grown-ups, the life expectancy would already be more than 100. A baby born today, at least in a developed society, and if he is born to the right class, to say the middle class or the upper class, he has a very good chance of living to be more than 100. Most of this jump in the life expectancy was caused not by solving the diseases of old people, but by overcoming child diseases and decreasing child mortality. Again, as we mentioned in one of the first lessons, even previously, if say 500 years ago, you managed to reach the age of 20, you had still a good chance of living to be 70 or 80. But reaching 20, this was very, very difficult. About a quarter to a third of children born in pre-modern, even in 19th century societies, died before reaching 20. The biggest achievements in the fight against death over the last century was the result of curing all these illnesses of children. If you want to understand what life was like and how people raised families in the centuries and millennia before the triumphs of modern science, a good example is the family of King Edward I of England and his wife Queen Eleanor that ruled England in the late 13th century. The children of the king and queen, the princes and princesses, enjoyed the best conditions that could be provided in medieval Europe. They lived in palaces, they had as much food as they liked to eat, they had plenty of warm clothing, and they had the cleanest water available, and they had an army of servants and doctors that looked after their needs and their health. The sources that we found mention 16 children that Queen Eleanor bore her husband between 1255 and 1284. I would like to read to you the list of these children and what happened to each and every one of them as a kind of indication or example for what it meant to live and to raise a family in the age before modern medicine. So the first child that we know about, that Queen Eleanor bore her husband in 1255, it was a daughter. We don't know the name of the daughter. She died at birth and probably may not have been given any name at all. The second child was again a daughter called Catherine. She died either at the age of 1 or of 3. The sources are mixed on this. The third child, another daughter, Joanne, died when she was 6 months. The fourth child was the first son, John. He died when he was 5. And number 5, another son, Henry, he died when he was 6. The sixth child, a daughter called Eleanor, she reached the age of 29 before dying. This is the first child that reached adulthood. 7, an anonymous daughter who died when she was 5 months old. 8, another daughter, Joanne, died when she was 35. 9, a son, Alfonso, died at the age of 10. 10, a daughter, Margaret, she died when she was 58. 11, another daughter, Berengaria, died when she was 2 years old. 12, an anonymous daughter who died very shortly after birth. The 13th child, a daughter, Mary, died when she was 53. 14, a son, we don't know his name, died shortly after birth. 15, a daughter, Elizabeth, died when she was 34. And 16, a son, Edward. This Edward was the first of the royal princes, of the boys, who managed to survive the dangerous years of childhood and to reach adulthood. And when his father, King Edward I, died, this boy, Edward, became the new King of England, King Edward II. To the best of our knowledge, Eleanor and Edward were very healthy people. They had no fatal hereditary illnesses that they passed on to their children. Nevertheless, 10 out of these 16 children, 62%, died when they were children, before reaching adulthood. Only 6 of the royal children managed to live beyond the age of 11, and only 3 managed to live beyond the age of 40. In addition to these 16 children, it is likely that Eleanor was pregnant several more times, and these pregnancies ended in miscarriage. On average, even if we ignore the miscarriages, Edward and Eleanor lost a child every 3 years, 10 children one after the other. For parents today, it's basically impossible to conceive of such a loss. But back then, it was, not every family was like this, but it was not uncommon. Whether or not the Gilgamesh project really succeed in completely defeating death, from a historical perspective, what is fascinating to see is that most late modern religions and ideology have already taken death out of the equation, are already ignoring death. Until the 18th century, most religions considered death and what happened to you after you die as central to the meaning of life. Beginning in the 18th century, religions and ideologies such as liberalism, socialism, and feminism began to treat death simply as a technical problem and lost all interest in the afterlife, in what happens to you after you die. For example, ask yourself, what happens to a communist after he or she dies? In Islam and Christianity, there is a very clear answer what happens to a Christian after he or she dies. But in communism, no communist is interested in what happens after death. Similarly with capitalism, what happens to a capitalist after he or she dies? Nobody cares. What happens to a feminist? Again, nobody cares. It's pointless to look for the answer in the writings of Marx, Karl Marx, of Adam Smith, or Simone de Beauvoir, what happens to a feminist or to a communist after they die, because nobody's interested in death except as a technical problem. The only modern ideology that still gives death a central role is nationalism. In sometimes at least, nationalism promises that after you die, if you die for the nation, then after you die, you would continue to live on in the memory of the nation, but even nationalists don't really know what this means. I mean, in Christianity, you're giving very, very clear answers what happens to you after you die. You die, and then you go to your soul, goes out of the body, and it comes before God, and God judges it. It looks at all the good deeds you did and all the bad deeds you did, and it decides whether to send you to heaven or to hell. In nationalism, this idea that if you die for the nation, afterwards you will live forever in the nation, in the memory of the nation, it is something so hazy, so difficult to understand, that even most nationalists, even if they say so, they don't really understand what it means. We are living then in a technical age. What our ancestors saw as political and ethical and spiritual dilemmas, for us, it's just technical problems. Let the scientists work out some solution. The amazing achievements of modern science in finding solutions, solutions to lightning, to poverty, even to death, have caused more and more people to become ardent believers in progress, in the ideal of progress. Many people today are convinced that science works for the benefit of humankind, and that we can trust science wholeheartedly. Just let the scientists go on with their work, with all the researchers, and they will create heaven here on earth, not after death, but on earth in this life. But as we shall see in the next segment, things are not so rosy and not so simple.